Welcome back to the Masters of the Universe Classic Director's Commentary with me, Scott Toyguru Neitlich, the brand manager for the bulk of the line, 10 years, etc. Today we are going to talk about He-Ro, our second San Diego Comic-Con exclusive, and really the first figure that kind of showed the full potential of the line and how deep we were going to get. But real quick, first, an update. We are very close to our 1,000 subscriber goal, our first sort of stretch goal. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so, because you're going to help unlock some really cool content, which I'll also kind of mention at the very end of the video, so stick around for that. So subscribe if you haven't. Awesome. All right, back to He-Ro. I need a hero. I'm not going to sing. I'm not a singer. He was an amazing figure, and he was a figure that maybe a lot of people before he came out hadn't really heard of. So we're going to have to take a trip back in time and talk a little bit about He-Ro and who he was. So back in 1987, the line was set for an expansion, and they were going to introduce a new lead character named He-Ro. This is him from the 87 Mattel catalog. And they were also going to introduce his mentor character, Eldor, actually who was originally called Mentor, but then he became Eldor. It's kind of like an Obi-Wan wizard kind of trainer character. So Super 7 actually did a He-Ro figure on what would have been the 87 card back. They were going to change the card back up, the branding. I think this is amazingly cool. I so applaud them for doing this, even down to the back of the card art. I mean, unbelievable. Props to you guys, Super 7. This is a really cool toy. All right. So that's what it would have looked like had the toy been made, but the toy was never made. But that didn't stop He-Ro from sneaking out into pop culture in a couple ways. The biggest being his appearance in the very last mini-comic from the vintage line, which was called The Powers of Grayskull Part 1. It was meant to obviously have Part 2 and 3. And He-Ro appeared at the very end on one of the last panels as the guy sending He-Man back to his own time. He-Man had spent time in the past, in Preternia. And that was the only image we had of him in the comic. He was kind of in shadow. And it ended with He-Man saying, "But who is he?" Well, that question wasn't really answered. But He-Ro and the characters from Preternia continued to appear in a lot of media that was prepped before the line ended, including on the final art cross-sell poster. But instead of He-Ro riding on his Turbo Dash, he was replaced by King Randor, and Skeletor got on Tyrannosaurus, and He-Man's riding Bionatops. You're like, wait, what are you talking about? Who are these dinosaur characters? I'll finish getting into that in a minute. But the point is, these were characters from the Preternia He-Ro line that never came out. He even made it into the style guide, that infamous 87 style guide, where we picked up so much of the information for the bios from. So, yeah, this character was very, very much flushed out and was prepared to carry the torch of the line if it hadn't been for the fact that the line went away after 87 from overshipping. And I'll do a whole video about why the vintage line kind of crashed and burned at the end. But He-Ro and the giants and the dinosaurs, well, he was meant to be the flagship character, the new character that was going to keep the line going into the future. Now, this isn't something limited to the 87 He-Man line. This is done all the time in toy lines. A good example is the 2000X line was refreshed in year 2 to have a Versus the Snake Men theme. And the packaging was changed from the bricks to the snake and to a green color palette. Again, not something that's limited to the He-Man line. Something like Star Wars. I mean, they change their branding all the time. They went from that bright orange to the green Power of the Force, and then white cards. Then all sorts. There's been there must be like 30 different Star Wars cards from the last 30 years. The point is, toy lines do this all the time. They find new ways to keep the brand going and refresh. And the way the 87 line was going to get refreshed was by introducing dinosaurs, giants, and He-Ro, this new character. So these are some of the Dinosaur Ride Ons that were introduced. They included characters like Tyrannosaurus Rex, who was going to be King Hiss's ride. Kind of like how Skeletor had Panther and He-Man had Battle Cat. This was going to be like the signature ride for King Hiss, who existed in Preternia, and he shot out a little spiked disc out of his stomach. And unlike He-Ro or Eldor, this dinosaur was actually produced and made it to market. A few of the dinosaurs did. So you could actually own this figure, and you can put King Hiss on him if you felt like it, or Skeletor tends to ride him sometimes. But yeah, this toy actually did make it into production. What also made it into production was He-Man's new mount, which was Bionatops, which was a Torosaurus. No, not a Triceratops. Go look it up. They never existed. It was a Torosaurus. Maybe I'll do a video about dinosaurs one day. All right. So this was He-Man's Torosaurus Ride, and this was kind of like his version of Battle Cat for Preternia when he went back in time. And again, it made it into production. And you can, still get this toy on eBay and put He-Man behind it, and, et cetera, et cetera. We never made it in classics. That would have been really cool. I love dinosaurs. I would have liked to have made dinosaurs, but there were a lot of tooling and not much reuse. There wasn't like a, Panther Battle Cat alternate paint deco. And then, of course, Turbodactyl, the flying dinosaur. And this one, you'll notice, look who's riding him on the box there. There is our beloved He-Ro. So this was He-Ro's signature mount. And this made it into production. So you basically had his mount that came out, but He-Ro never did, which is why Randor was on him on that cross-sell poster a little while back. But, here's the toy, and there you go. You can see He-Ro riding on top of him in that Power of Grayskull packaging. What also made it to market were the giants, Megator and Titus. Now, these only got released in Europe, and I did a whole video about kind of why figures sometimes only get released in Europe. I'll put a tag to it. But Megator and Titus here are kind of holy grails for collectors. And there's He-Ro there at the very bottom. He just keeps sneaking out onto packaging. It's almost like there were huge plans for him. And here was the other giant. The counterpart to Megator was Titus. And you will notice that both Titus and Megator were the only figures in the vintage line that had rooted hair. Wait a minute, does that make them action figures or dolls? I guess by my definition, that makes them dolls. So click on the video here to learn more about that. But when we released the giants in the Classics line eventually, we definitely gave them sculpted hair, well, except for Megator's alternate head, but the main versions had sculpted hair to make sure they were action figures and not dolls. Not that boys can't play with dolls. It's perfectly fine. I loved my She-Ra when I was a kid. I loved combing her hair. Okay, I'm on a tangent. There's a He-Ro again. There he is. Look, at the base of Megator fighting against King Hiss. He-Ro seemed to sneak into all of the art, even though he never got released. Here he is on the back of the package. So there's our He-Ro, constantly making appearances, yet never as a toy. He just could not make it as a toy. All he made it was onto comic books and cross-sell art and into the imaginations of fans as they wondered what could have been. Well, as we said in the ad, the original He-Ro of Eternia returns for the first time. We were going to do He-Ro in the Classics line. He was the perfect figure to do as a Comic-Con figure because he was going to generate a lot of PR, because this is a figure, hardcore fans knew a lot about, and he represented what we were going to do with the line and how far we could take it beyond just the core figures. Now with the bio here, He-Ro came up very early on in the bio construction, much like how Orko was going to be more than just comedic relief. We were going to make him into a much more powerful character. We had to tackle the issue of He-Ro and King Grayskull, because the 2000X series introduced King Grayskull as an ancestor to He-Man. And originally He-Ro was going to be He-Man's ancestor. So this was the family tree that was created for the 2000X line. Ian Richter got this to me. It's one of the cool things he gave me when he left Mattel that I held on to for all these years, because I don't know if anyone's ever seen this. It's pretty cool. But yeah, it showed, King Grayskull as He-Man's ancestor. And we wanted to make He-Ro also very important to He-Man's origin. So the idea was to make He-Ro the bringer of the sword, if you will. And some of this even came from the original outlines for what was called the Rangers of Grayskull, or what became the Powers of Grayskull that Tim Kilpin provided for me when he knew I was researching the bios. Tim was the general manager of Mattel, but he was also the copywriter back in the day, and he wrote the storyline, and he actually had the notes, which was amazing. So we were going to find a way to transform this image from the catalog and find a way to bring He-Ro to life in classics. And that's what we did. And he really showed how far the line could go, and that we weren't just going to do the core characters, which up to this point, minus King Grayskull, we pretty much did. Another thing we did with him was we had different colored spell stones in the staff. Green was the most common at 50%, then red at 30%, and purple at 20%. And this was just to make a fun chase variant, especially because it was first released at Comic-Con. It was random which one you were going to get, although fans did figure out if they shined a flashlight in the package, they could kind of figure out which gem they had. But it was just a fun way to, again, create things for fans to talk about, because we didn't have books. I mean, we had that art book, but at Comic-Con we didn't have movies or TV shows. We just had the figures. So getting people to talk about them was all we could do. And then for Comic-Con specifically, under the armor, we put the logo. So if you bought the figure at the show, you got this version. And if you didn't want to see the Comic-Con logo, it was covered up by the armor. So it kind of wasn't a big deal for those who didn't want to see it. But it was a little something extra special for those who bought it at the show, because now that we had Matty Collector, you could buy our Comic-Con exclusives after the show online. And we wanted to do something special for those who actually bought it at the show. So yeah, that was kind of, that was back when doing Comic-Con sort of chase figures was a thing to do. People don't really do that anymore. But if you look back at like 2004 through 2011, that was like a huge trend, was to make chase figures for Comic-Con with like alternate heads or, alternate decos or something like that. The last thing to talk about was his sword. So the Horseman had originally done the sword in kind of a space clear black star-ish shade, if you will. And this was something, personally, I really wanted to change, because the whole idea was the sword was going to hold the energy of Castle Grayskull, which was inspired by the orb and the crystal chamber from the Sorceress's chamber in 2000X. And if you remember, the crystal chamber was all blue. It was covered in this blue crystal. And so that was the color we wanted to make the sword, because we had big plans for the sword and the orb and the energy. We knew eventually we were going to get to do this orb and orb holders, which we actually did 2 of them, one with Castle Grayskull and one with a Sorceress variant. So we wanted to make sure the sword represented that energy. The orb eventually came with a King Grayskull single release we did. So that's why we changed the color from that sort of grayish black into the blue. And again, with King Grayskull's sword, that was supposed to represent draining the energy from the sword into the orb. So the sword originally would have been blue, and then King Grayskull took that energy, let it flow out of the blade, forming the orb. So that's why the sword needed to match the orb. And of course, there were unhappy fans. There were people who didn't like this, and I definitely got plenty of death threats. And no, I'm not kidding. I really did get death threats. We'll talk about that more later, once we hit that 1,000 subscriber goal. So if you haven't subscribed, subscribe now, and you'll get to hear all about the many death threats that I received. And yeah, fans are fun.